Hey Adam, hey Pat.
Hey, Nour.
Morning.
So we are now a fortnight into the election campaign, and when you compare the issues that were dominating the political debate last election and this time, there is one issue that was really front and centre the last election that is almost entirely absent now. Adam, and that's something that you quite consistently report on.
Yeah, look, it certainly feels like we were talking about the climate crisis a lot more 3 years ago than we are at this election. And there are obvious reasons for that. The cost of living has really sort of blacked out the sun as an issue that's of concern to voters in recent times. But it's a striking change. We have been through a number of cases in Australia where we've had climate change elections. And last time was sort of the granddaddy of them. It really was front and centre. It was one of the main issues that I think voters had frustration with Scott Morrison, and we saw a wave of some support for Labor, but also the crossbenchers to come in on that. And we're 2 weeks into the campaign, and it really isn't being discussed yet. And otherwise, we're talking a lot about energy and gas in particular, without actually mentioning the climate crisis when the two really go hand in hand. I think it's been pretty remarkable.
I think Adam's right in that there's a few reasons why it's different this time around in 2022. We've just been through floods and bushfires. So the climate crisis was really foremost in people's minds. And there was a lot of anger about Scott Morrison. Famously, he walked into Parliament with a big lump of coal. He was sort of unapologetic about his approach on it. So, but we're in a different time now. And I think, to be fair, the environment is not the only issue that's been ignored in this election campaign. There's things like, the inadequate level of Centrelink payments, which, hasn't been mentioned, reforms to things like negative gearing. All of those things are also not being addressed. There's many, many others. But I think that the one that is probably most conspicuous in its absence is climate change and the state of the environment.
And look, and while I think that's true, I'll just add, there's another way to look at it, which is it's another climate election, but we're just not calling it that. The election was supposed to be, if Labor had had its way originally, on April 12th, this Saturday. It was delayed because of Cyclone Alfred. Now, that wasn't due to climate change alone, obviously, by any means, but we know cyclones are becoming more intense. And, the impact of that has pushed us later into the election. And we're talking a lot about cost of living. We're talking about energy policy. Underpinning it all is the need to deal with climate change. That's why we're changing our energy systems. It just, for some reason, we don't seem to acknowledge that in the daily political and sometimes media debate, I think.
That's really interesting. I do want to ask you, Adam, about, there has been this emphasis on cost of living, as you've both noted. But we know that the environment, that nature, that climate change is also something that is front of mind for voters. Where does it stand? Because you've referred to some polling in some of your reporting, Adam, that tells us that people care about this.
Yeah, well, if climate change is sort of absent from the open discussion in the debate, like nature is missing it almost entirely, and that's not a new thing. There was an interesting recent survey, an in-depth survey that they're doing annually now by the Biodiversity Council, which is a not-for-profit set up by 11 universities, which, they asked a range of questions, but it really showed that nature is a greater concern and perhaps a greater passion for people than I think public discussion, where it is largely missing, suggests. Now, surveys we have to take with a grain of salt. People will emphasise things that they care about, but that may not actually decide how they vote, and so it doesn't always follow through. But yeah, it was a really quite striking finding that like 96% of people felt care about nature and felt there should be greater focus on it. And we're not hearing it mentioned.
We know that this is a big deal for young voters in particular, and that's something that we've been reporting on as well. There is this disconnect with some of the issues that young voters would like to see political parties act on versus what's actually being spoken about.
Yeah, look, we did a call out to young voters, and we spoke to hundreds of young voters all around Australia, and there is a big sense of disillusionment, of anxiety, depression amongst young voters, that the issues that they care about, nature, climate change, the environment, are not being taken as seriously as they would like to see them. I think there is a divide between younger voters and older voters in this area. And, perhaps one bit that gives me hope in all of this is that as the demographics of Australia's voting profile change, that we will again start to see this issue coming up to the fore.
And to draw attention to all of this, The Guardian has published a series called Last Chance. It looks at the extinction crisis facing Australia. Just how urgent, Adam, is action on this issue?
I mean, it's incredibly urgent and has been for some time. We sat down last year, our environment team, we have 4 reporters who work in the area and senior editors, and thought about how can we highlight the issue of threatened species, because there has been a huge rise in the number of native species listed as at risk of extinction in the last 550 in the last 10 years. And it sort of flies under the radar, I think, how seismic a change in our country that could be. And we're talking about a lot of species that we take for granted. The koala is the emblematic one. But all up, we have 2,200, more than 2,200 listed species and ecosystems at risk of extinction across the country. So we thought, how do we highlight this? We went out across the country, picked a handful of species, shot some videos of people who are passionate people, volunteers in most cases, who really dedicate their lives to try to save these species, and I guess highlight the gap between what they are doing in their own time and what we are doing as a country to try and address this sharp decline.
One of the pieces that really resonated with me was about the boggle moth, because just in the time that I was reporting in Canberra, I noticed the decline, because they used to sort of fill the ceilings of Parliament House. And it was, personally, you don't love moths diving at you as you're trying to file your story and like getting into your shoes and all the rest of it. But within a matter of years, that completely changed. And one of the pieces focuses on that ecological and cultural implications of the decline of the boggle moth, which migrates from Queensland down to the Victorian Alps.
Environment reporter Petra Stock and videographer Lisa Favazzo went up into the high country in Victoria to tell that story. They went up there with people from the Taungurung community. And I think it's a really powerful look at the cultural impact, the cultural importance, and the ecological importance of this species. As you say, it's been a huge crash in a short amount of time. The famous stories at the Sydney Olympics where you had these moths coming in attracted by the stadium lights, and it looked like a weather front coming in. Some of the broadcasters mistook it for weather, and that's a generation ago.
One of the pieces I loved in this series was Lisa Cox wrote about the eastern curlew, which is just a incredible migratory bird that flies all the way from Asia, thousands and thousands of kilometres to feed on mudflats in Darwin. But those mudflats that it depends on for its survival are at the moment being threatened by development there of a massive export terminal for basically fossil fuels at the moment. And that is something that Labor is intending to go ahead with at the moment. So I think that piece just highlights that there are choices still to be made that are confronting us at the moment, and why it should be an election issue.
And, there were some big promises made in the last term of Parliament about what could be done to try and deal with this issue, but in the end, they weren't followed through on.
And I want to talk about that. Labor came to government promising to take action on environment. Have things actually gone backwards when it comes to sort of the legislative protections in place for the environment? How have Labor gone about implementing some of the things that it said it would?
Yeah, that's right. They came to power promising to fix what they called broken national environment laws, which were drafted in the Howard era, and it hadn't been changed since then. And the Prime Minister was asked about this yesterday by one of our reporters at a doorstop in Paddy's Market in Sydney. And he acknowledged again that, environment laws were broken. It was a promise that they were going to fix these laws and institute a federal environmental protection agency. And those reforms have stalled. they face some backlash, particularly from Western Australian MPs. Labor is very worried about holding on to their seats in Western Australia. There are obviously deeply embedded interests in the resources sector in Western Australia who objected to this. So those reforms, which were really core promises, were pretty much put in the too hard basket for Labor in this term of government. And they've said, we're going to fix it. We're going to, fix the laws next term of government. But it does raise the question of, you said that last time, how much should we believe you this time round?
And it's not for a lack of trying by the Environment Minister, Tanya Plibersek, is it?
Well, she certainly, I think it's fair to say the Prime Minister has intervened to stop negotiations that Tanya Plibersek was having with the crossbench and the Greens in particular to try and get laws through late last year to introduce an EPA. But I do think that the government and the minister created a problem for itself near the start of the term by setting such an ambitious agenda. In her first major speech on the environment, Tanya Plibersek said the environment's back on the priority list under Labor, and promised to fix the laws that everybody, industry groups, environment groups, all political parties, anyone with expertise says isn't working, and they haven't done that. So it's a very challenging area in which to bring about reform, but it is also quite clear what is needed. There have been a huge amount of advice over time that we need national environment standards against which developments can be tested. The government tried to bring together industry and environment groups to agree on what those standards were going to be. That's just not going to happen realistically. In the end, the governments are going to have to make decisions. You asked at the start whether we've gone backwards. We certainly haven't gone forwards. And what we now have is Labor promising to address these issues if re-elected. But we don't actually know how, and they've said it won't be the same model they pursued in this term. So it feels back at square one. We don't actually know. And on the other hand, the coalition's position is there's no problem here. We need to approve developments put forward by industry more rapidly, and there's no issue with environmental protection in the country despite all evidence.
Coming back to that question about have we gone backwards, I think one area where we clearly have gone backwards is in what's happening in Tasmania with salmon farming, particularly in Macquarie Harbour, where there is an endangered species of fish, the Maugean skate, which Tim Flannery, one of Australia's most famous scientists and environmentalists, has written a great piece for this series about. This is a fish that's survived from the time of dinosaurs, 40 million years old, and used to be widespread around the world, but is now only surviving in small parts of the kind of coastal waters of Tasmania. It's under threat from the salmon farming in the harbour, but we have this situation where rather than creating legislation or drafting legislation to protect the Maugean skate, Labor has intervened to protect the salmon industry from environmentalists taking action against in the courts and so on.
I mean, for the environmental sector, environmental organisations, that was galling in its own right, but it was particularly, they were particularly angry and had a particularly strong response because it came after the failure to deliver on other laws, and then it was seen as, well, this is actually a step to weaken the laws that you promised you would fix. Not the best way to end the term of government.
And angered some within Labor's own base as well. I guess for some, it wouldn't be entirely surprising that the coalition isn't keen to talk about this issue during the campaign. But is this why Labor doesn't seem particularly enthusiastic about bringing up the environment, nature, climate change? Why is it absent on their part?
I mean, I think part of it is that the message that they've received, or they say they've received, is that the electorates that will decide the election are particularly and sharply focused on cost of living, and climate change arguments are hard to land in their view. Now, you can make a case against that, I think. I mean, and they have done that to some extent this week with the batteries policy. That is an attempt to address cost of living concerns for those who can afford batteries now that they're subsidised. I mean, I think there's also an element to it, which is that they see nature protection as an issue for the Greens and not a lot of value for Labor in going after it. I think that's misguided, and that there is and the polling by the Biodiversity Council has shown this, that there is a underlying level of support for environmental action that Labor supporters, coalition supporters, people across the community would like to see and would engage with. But that's not been the decision that Labor has made.
And so, Pat, we're now seeing this peculiar thing where there is a lot of talk about energy policy, but almost entirely devoid of its connections to climate change, as Adam mentioned earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. The discussion about energy is who will lower your bills and by how much. That's what that's what the pollsters are telling politicians that people want to know about. But it is entirely divorced from the question of emissions. It's um, you know, we still don't have a coalition pledge about what they're going to do for the 2030 climate targets. They've said, oh, we're going to make that decision in government. That's just extraordinary, really, considering where we were at the last election and previous elections as well, with governments being hounded to put out their details and their costings. And now we have a situation where the coalition are not giving details about costings or releasing them, in the middle of a debate so that people can't scrutinise them properly, which we saw this week. And they're not releasing details about emissions either.
No, well, I mean, I think one of the remarkable things is at the time we're talking, the coalition has no policy to reduce emissions in the next decade. They have policies to relax some of Labor's climate measures. They say they'd build nuclear power plants eventually, but that wouldn't have an impact for a couple of decades if it were possible. And there are serious doubts that we've talked about before about that. So at the moment, they have only policies to increase emissions. And I think it's remarkable that we don't talk about that as a country more. Whereas Labor also, despite planning to, we assume, if they're back in power, roll out more ambitious climate targets, for 2035, the only policy we've seen is a batteries policy, which is good, but that's not going to drive the sort of transformational change across the economy we need. It should be like one part of a suite of measures. As far as we know at this stage, it may be all we get in the campaign. I hope I'm proved wrong on that.
Is climate and the climate crisis a cost of living issue in and of itself?
Absolutely. I mean, look, insurance is the great example of that, right? Insurance costs have gone through the roof. Forecasts are that they're going to go much higher again, and there are parts of the country already where they've been hit by extreme weather events where people now are struggling to get insured. And there was a particularly cheery statement this week from a board member of one of the world's biggest insurance companies, Allianz SE, that he said basically the climate crisis is on track to destroy capitalism, which sounds kind of glib, but the argument was that with the vast cost of extreme weather, and it's rising all the time, it's really going to leave the financial sector unable to operate. I don't think we've got a head around just how big a deal this potentially is going to be and what the ramifications are. And that flows through to all of us.
But even within the energy debate, there's a somewhat strange debate over gas happening at the moment, where the coalition has pointed to gas as the answer to bring down bills. Gas is the most expensive part of the energy mix. Even if you bring the prices down, I think they're aiming to bring it down from sort of currently the price cap is $13 or $14 a gigajoule, yeah, down to $10. But that's still expensive, and it's still going to be the most expensive part of the energy mix. The more you can do for consumers to, for example, introduce batteries, as Adam mentioned, electrify households, that is all going to bring down the cost of living for people substantially in many cases. The biggest uptake of solar is not amongst inner city liberals. It's in regional towns where people have large roofs and the capacity to get off the grid. They love it for reliability. It's cheaper. There's all these benefits that even if you set aside the environmental impacts of fossil fuel burning and the climate impacts, there are really good reasons to do this because it lowers our bills. It reduces our reliance on fossil fuel imports from overseas, which, in a very difficult geostrategic environment at the moment, that's all good stuff to do.
And one of the remarkable things about the gas push by the coalition, if we put aside for a second the fact that no one's talking about the emissions and it's a fossil fuel, is that they released what they called modelling this week. There was no actual modelling included from Frontier Economics. It was a 15-page report. And the argument was for electricity prices, which is not the only place where we see the impact of gas, but the one that reaches the most people. The estimate was that it would bring down power bills by 3%. Now, 3% is kind of not nothing, obviously, but it's kind of in the wind in terms of changes in electricity bills Other things have much greater impact. We see more than that in variability year to year. It seems a fairly extraordinary thing to be structuring so much of the political debate around.
It also strikes me that you've now got the Coalition and the Greens in somewhat agreement that there isn't a gas shortage.
I think that might be our most significant part of that debate, actually. We just need to take the next step and say, right, well, given it's a fossil fuel and we have a lot of it and we have to limit its use eventually, what are we going to do that? And how do we get it where we need it?
Well, we've now talked about the political debate. What role does the media have in setting the agenda or perhaps drawing people's attention back to what is, an urgent and existential crisis?
I think obviously media organisations have to cover the campaign, but how we cover the campaign, and we have to cover the day-to-day of it, but how we cover the campaign is really important. We don't just have to follow the buses around and report all the pick facts that the politicians do. We can go deeper than that, and we can put issues, as we have done with this Last Chance series that's documenting the extinction crisis. We can try and put issues on the agenda, and we can try and interrogate politicians for answers and see what they're promising, and try and move beyond, their talking points.
There are smarter people than me who know this better, who have said people are more disengaged from politics than ever. And I think most people going around and talking to people they know I think a significant part of the population is barely paying attention. I think it's really important that while the media follows and holds to account what our leaders and would-be leaders are saying, we also need to decide what the issues are that matter based on what our readers and our audience tell us and the research that we do, and highlight them. And as Pat said, that's what we've tried to do with Last Chance this week, to say this is an issue that should be on the national agenda. There's a real logic to it. The health of the environment matters to us and our survival as a species, as well as the species that are in decline. What are we going to do about it? There are steps we could take that we're not. It feels like an issue we should be talking more and more about.
Okay, now it's time for what we can't get out of our head. Adam, what was it for you?
Other than nature and gas.
And the boggon moth.
And the boggon moth. Look, back on the election, it felt like there was an archetypal story that this week, when the leaders had a debate on Wednesday night, and before it was over and we knew what the audience thought, the Liberal National Party posted on social media that Peter Dutton had won the debate. This was before the studio audience had actually indicated what it thought.
Which ultimately gave the debate to Albanese.
Yes, that's right. And, make what you will of that. I don't think we should put too much weight on it, but it's a very shallow response. Surely we deserve better.
And Pat, what was it for you?
I've been watching, probably a lot of Australians, the stock market going crazy this week, with Trump announcing and then unannouncing tariffs, pausing them, putting them at various levels on places as diverse as Macquarie Island and Norfolk Island. But amidst all of that, people have been looking for what the Trump administration strategy is in all of this. And one of the things I thought highlighted that's a bit of a fool's errand is their announcement this week on, we're going to bring iPhone manufacturing back to America, because all the experts, including Tim Cook from Apple, who Trump calls Tim Apple. So he said, look, this is just a complete non-starter. Foxconn, which is one of the major contractors, Taiwanese company that makes the iPhone in China, they have 700,000 employees in China, or around the world, sorry. There's about 200,000 people in China just directly making the iPhone, let alone finding all those people in the US, moving the factories. You just couldn't even find the tooling experience, the engineering experience, trying to bring all those jobs back. But, and let alone the cost of that, you'd end up with an iPhone. Some people have estimated it would cost, $5,000 to buy an iPhone. Would you not just go and buy a Samsung? I think the whole thing just displays this lack of strategy amongst what they're actually trying to do here, and a lack of understanding about how modern commerce works and how interconnected world trade is at the moment. We're not in the 1970s. You can't just, manufacture things in a factory in Ohio anymore. It relies on huge global supply chains, and it just betrays a lack of thinking on the Trump administration's behalf.
Oh, really?
Shocker.
I'm shocked.
Pat, Adam, thank you so much.
Thanks, Nour.
Thanks.